Welcome to Gever.com, where the wise get wiser. Well, today we're going to be getting started with a few things to know about Biblical Hebrew if you're just new to the language and you're really uncertain of where to start. But even if you have been around Hebrew just a little bit, we're going to be talking a little about the history of the written language. So how do we get the Hebrew Bible that we have today? Has it always been the same? Well, we're going to learn just a little bit about that in our lesson today. So let's go ahead and get started. Right. Well, with Biblical Hebrew, one of the first places that you have to start and the first things you need to know is that Hebrew is written from right to left. From right to left. Now, English is the opposite. It's from left to right. So, this might seem a little strange. It might feel a little bit weird, but I promise that after a little while, it will actually become rather normal. Though, even for myself, it does take a second if I've not been looking at Hebrew for maybe a little while. The brain has to kind of readjust to the different form and the different patterns. So as you can see here, this is an example of Genesis 1:1, which we're going to look at in some different variations here. But Hebrew is written from right to left. So the text starts over here to the right, and it is read to the left. So this one is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And as you might know or be familiar with, there are several other languages out there that are also written from right to left, such as Arabic and Syriac, and a few languages related to Persian. There's also a number from ancient times. However, most languages in the world are not written from right to left. It's somewhat unique in that respect. One other thing that we should discuss as we're getting started here is the fact that in ancient Hebrew and even in modern Hebrew, vowels are not necessarily considered a part of the alphabet. So they're actually learned separately. And actually, in ancient times and even modern times, they're not normally written. Vowels are typically considered just for the Bible and for children. So they are very helpful, as you might imagine. So in our top example here, we have that same phrase from Genesis 1:1 without the vowels. So as you can see here, these are just the consonant letters. And we're going to be learning all of these letters in the alphabet throughout our course here. But as you can see in the lower example, there are, on this form, or in this verse, this variation, there are all these little dots and dashes and markings, which are both vowels and a few other helpful notations for accents and other things for grammar. So as you can see here, we have again the same phrase, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Genesis 1:1. And so these are really the two ways that Hebrew is typically written, either without vowels or with vowels. So as just an example here, try to imagine what it would be like to read Genesis 1:1, as you see here, with our vowels highlighted or included. Right? So we could see in English, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Very familiar. But you'll notice that I highlighted our vowels in red. So let's imagine if we were to try to read this without the vowels, even in English. So as you can see here, this would look a little strange, especially initially. So you'd have kind of this, the begin, God created heavens and the earth, right? Now, even though this might seem a bit strange or odd, actually, if this were more common, you could actually probably figure out what this was saying, especially certain words like the and beginning, God, perhaps created, heavens. So there would be some familiar patterns and words that you could probably very easily pick out. And so this is how it is also for especially ancient and even modern Hebrew. So again, modern Hebrew doesn't use vowels in their normal newspapers and writings and articles because it's just not necessary. But they are included for the Bible because we want to have the most accurate and the most reliable translation that we can, especially for those of us who are not native Hebrew speakers. We need a little bit of help. But also this helps to communicate the tradition that has been passed down over the years. Now, I also mentioned that we're going to be talking just a little bit about the history of the Hebrew language. And really, I should say the Hebrew script or writing style, because the language itself is, very old and ancient. And we don't exactly know how or when or exactly where it began, so to speak. Perhaps it goes all the way back to Genesis 1:1. But more than likely, it was developed over time. But what we do know is a little bit about the writing that took place in the history, because we have some different artifacts and writings and inscriptions that we can look at and compare. So one of the earliest forms of Hebrew writing actually came with what is called Proto-Sinaitic. And so you'll see that up here on the top example. And this is actually an example. Now, we don't have a record of this, but this is just me kind of recreating, if you will, Genesis 1:1 in this script or this writing style. So we don't, unfortunately, have Genesis 1:1 in the script. But as you can see here, this script dates from about 1200 BC to about 2000 BC. So about the time of the Judges to probably maybe almost about the time of Abraham, maybe just a little bit after, but certainly during the time of Moses and the original writing of the Torah. So more than likely, the original Torah would have been written, at least parts, or if not most of it, if all of it, in this early Proto-Sinaitic script or writing style. And the reason it's called Proto-Sinaitic, at least by some, there's some other names given to it, is that it was actually found initially in the Sinai Peninsula, which is where the Egyptians in ancient times had mines, where many of the slaves would go to dig out and mine the special minerals and ores for the kingdom of Egypt. And so they found this writing style there, which, as you can see, is kind of like a hieroglyphic type of language. So you can see here that's like a bull's head. We have one that looks kind of like water, which is related to the word for water. We have another one that kind of looks like a human head, right? And so each of these letters indicated or represented a particular sound, just as we would think of as an alphabet. Now, this might not seem particularly unique or special, but this was actually a huge and important development in the history of writing, because what happened here is they were developing what we think of now as an alphabet system of writing. But before that, hieroglyphics and the cuneiform and other similar writing styles were actually more like syllable sounds. And long story short, this would have made it much more difficult or complicated to read and to write, because in those other older versions of writing, you had to know like hundreds of different symbols, which is very challenging for the average person, especially since schools were not quite as common as they are today, especially in the Western world or the modern world. So the development of the alphabet was in many ways kind of like the development of the printing press. It really gave more open access to information and reading and writing that just really hadn't existed before that. So this was a really, really, really huge development for writing and literature in general, because it made it more accessible to the normal average person. Now, after Proto-Sinaitic, we come to what is often called Paleo-Hebrew, or maybe a kind of Phoenician or Aramaic style of writing. And actually, this is really just a kind of simplification of that slightly earlier version of Proto-Sinaitic. Several of the letters, if you were to compare them, are very similar. They just are simplified. Now, as you can see, the dates that are given to this are roughly around 580s, right, the time of the Babylonian exile, to roughly about, again, 12 or 1300 BC. It's hard to say exactly, but this would have been the dominant writing style, not only for Israel, but also many of the different people groups in the region. In fact, pretty much all of the inscriptions that we find from this period of time in that region have this writing style and this script a part of that as the writing style for that inscription. So this would have been the dominant writing form for much, if not most, of the Hebrew Bible that we have today. So why don't we have a Bible that looks like this? Why does our Hebrew Bible look different? Well, something interesting happened during the Babylonian exile, which occurred around 587, right? When Jerusalem and Judah was conquered by the Babylonians and they were taken away. And so many, if not most, of the elites from Jerusalem were taken over to Babylon, and in many ways were kind of integrated with the society, and they started using the Babylonian script. And so from then on, Hebrew, as we know it, was forever changed to this, what we think of now as the Hebrew script, though originally it was actually the Babylonian Aramaic type of writing style. Now, this does not mean that the language itself changed, right? So the words were the same, it would have sounded the same. It was simply that the style of letters looked slightly different. But that's perfectly fine because it still is communicating the exact same message, the same meanings, and all of that. It's just simply that after Israel came back from Babylon, they were using this other script. And that's because they were using the script that was most common throughout their world at the time. Because Aramaic, especially Babylonian Aramaic, had really kind of taken over and dominated the world at that point. So we actually can see here a couple interesting archaeological finds. So this is what is called a Bulla, which is like a little seal that would have been used for official documents and for sealing letters and things like that. And interestingly, this one has been ascribed to King Hezekiah, which, if you know, is one of the kings from Judah around the time of 700 BC. And this particular Bulla was discovered around 2010 in Jerusalem, and they're actually quite small, only about a half an inch by half an inch, so relatively small in diameter. So to help us kind of see the writing that's being used here, I wrote this out for us so we could kind of look at it, analyze it just a little bit more. So up here on the top is the Paleo-Hebrew, which is right from the Bulla itself. And then on the lower part is what would be the translation or the transliteration into the Babylonian square script that we are more familiar with nowadays, which is how Hebrew looks today. So, and one thing I have to point out is that a couple parts of this were not actually on the Bulla, and that's because it was a little damaged. But the rest of it would presumably indicate this was for Hezekiah. So in the Hebrew, this phrase here means for or belonging to Hezekiah. And then presumably it probably said son, Ben, and then probably of Ahaz, right? Because Ahaz was also a king of Judah before him. And then the word here, Melech, for king, and then Yahu, or Yehuda. So almost assuredly, this was a seal for King Hezekiah, king of Judah. And so this is really very fascinating and a really great find. Again, to corroborate the writing style of the time, they found, of course, many other forms of this to indicate that Hebrew was being written in this writing style, this Paleo-Hebrew form. Now, what's interesting is that after the Babylonian exile, as we mentioned, the writing script changed, but as I initially mentioned, the vowels were not actually a part of the writing script or style from the earliest of days. So we might ask, well, how did they come about? When did they come about? Well, if you jump down here to about 500 AD, that's when these scribes, the Masoretes, developed the vowel system that we see here, the dots and the dashes. And that's because at the time of 500 to about 1000 AD, Hebrew was no longer the common language among Jewish people or really anyone, because the Jewish people really didn't live in Israel anymore. They had to leave because Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by the Roman Empire. And even by then, the predominant language was Aramaic. So anyways, all that to say is Hebrew was becoming more remote, less common for people, and they wanted to preserve the text and the interpretations and the meanings of the Hebrew Bible because they were sacred. It was God's word. And no longer did they have some of the common knowledge of the scripture like they did in past times. So they added these vowels, again, to help with interpretation and reading, especially for people who are not native Hebrew speakers, which was very, very important, and still is for many of us. Now, interestingly, between that period is when we find our Dead Sea Scroll period, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls are hard to emphasize how important and how impactful that this find was for the study of the Hebrew Bible. So before about 1948 to 1950s, many scholars had assumed that the Hebrew Bible was not very reliable because most of our Hebrew Bible texts came from about the 1000 AD period. So we just really didn't have a lot of good texts or manuscripts that were older than that. And so many skeptical scholars, of course, just criticized the Bible and doubted it. But as I mentioned, about late 1940s, early 1950s, they actually found these hundreds and hundreds of scrolls, thousands of scrolls near the Dead Sea. And what was amazing is that they dated from, maybe as early as 200, 250 BC. So very, very early, relatively speaking. And what was great is that they contained elements or most of the Old Testament, and it aligned very, very well with the current or modern versions of the Hebrew Bible, which means that the scribes had done a really, really good job of copying it and transmitting and passing it down, which was really an amazing feat. Because again, if you don't have a printing press or a computer to spell check everything, this can be quite challenging and difficult. And it really was in ancient times. So as you can see here, this also is from Genesis 1:1. And part of it is not easy to see here and kind of damaged. But we can see here that we have Hashamayim va'et ha'eretz. So anyways, all that to say, the Dead Sea Scrolls were really a monumental discovery in ancient times. So that concludes our discussion on the history of the Hebrew Bible and just a couple very basic things to know as we're getting started. Of course, we're going to take some time to look through the entire Hebrew alphabet one by one so that by the end of learning the Hebrew alphabet, you will not only be very well aware and confident and familiar with the alphabet itself, but also a whole bunch of key words that are very common words in the Bible. And we're even going to take some time to read and give a little bit of insight on a few interesting and important verses that contain some of those key words. So that'll wrap us up for today. I look forward to seeing you next time.